So one of the questions coming out of the last several years of politics is what is the state of the American political parties today? What's happening to the American political parties? How should we understand that? How is this affecting governance? What have we done through law and policy to the political parties today? What is the role of outside groups, outside money, small donors, all these other forces in the political system today? And that's one of the things that we want to talk about on this panel. Another thing we want to talk about on this panel, sort of looking forward to the 2020 presidential election process, in which it looks right now like we may have 20-some odd Democratic candidates potentially running after a 2016 process in which we had on the Republican side something like 17 candidates running for the office. And what's happened to the presidential nominations process that we are now seeing a world that looks like this. It's unlike any previous presidential election cycles. Can our system manage it? What kinds of consequences follow from having a nomination process that works this way? Are there ways we might change it and the like? So those are kind of the framing questions. The panel here today was supposed to have someone we were very fortunate, we thought, to get, a woman named Mindy Myers, who has been the executive director, first woman who was the executive director of the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, and she was willing to come right in the aftermath of the midterms to give a postmortem from her perspective. Unfortunately, since the election appears to be continuing for Senate seats, she is actually now in Florida and sends her regrets. But of course, the other people we have on the panel, we're extremely pleased we're able to be here. I'll give just brief introductions. Ben Ginsberg, to my left over here, who is at the Jones Day firm for many decades, has been the leading election lawyer, political lawyer for the Republican Party. He's particularly knowledgeable about the Republican nominations process, the Republican convention process, and has been working on political party and election law related issues for almost as long or longer, I don't know, than his counterpart to my right here, Bob Bauer, who has been doing this on the Democratic Party side since the 1970s, I believe, if that's correct. Bob?
1870s.
It's important you corrected that because given your appearance, there might have been some confusion. We're good friends, in case you can't tell, or at least we were before that comment.
How could you not tell?
And so Bob has worked, helped create the political law, election law practice at the Perkins Coie firm in DC, which over time became the major firm representing the Democratic Party. His partner is now, I don't know, in Florida and in Alabama, in Georgia, and he's everywhere at the same time, as far as I can tell. But in any event, Bob was general counsel to both of the Obama campaigns, and then White House counsel to President Obama for a year and a half, and he's now a professor of practice. We're very fortunate to say here at NYU Law School, teaching courses on presidential powers and election law and those general subjects. Guy Charles, sitting here to my left, former student of mine from when I was in the 1870s, it feels like, when I taught at the University of Michigan Law School. And Guy has gone on to a very distinguished career now at Duke Law School, visiting at Harvard Law School, writing on districting, Voting Rights Act issues, election law related issues, issues involving race and the election process. And so we're glad to have Guy. I'm actually going on longer than I meant to with introductions. Paul Starr, I don't want to shortchange you, but Paul is the Stewart Professor of Communications and Public Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School and a Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at Princeton. And Paul is also one of the co-founders of the American Prospect magazine and has been writing for many years very interesting and important pieces on democracy in the United States, and has a book we'll talk about a little bit later coming out in the spring. And then all the way at the end, my colleague Bert Newborn, who you already met and many of you know. And Bert has, I think, been one of the premier sort of public law litigators in the United States over the course of his career. He was legal director of the ACLU for many, many years. Is on the NYU faculty, still extremely engaged and involved in these issues, and has a very creative set of ideas, as usual, that we're going to have a chance to talk about with respect to the U.S. Senate. Okay, that's the opening. We opened the last panel with a quote from a judge. Just recently in the New York Times, there was this op-ed piece that I thought was very apt for this panel by a guy named Moises Naim, who wrote a book I regard very highly called The End of Power. And he said, the disdain for politics as usual and therefore for parties locked in the status quo is intense, widespread, global. This is why anti-politics, the rejection of traditional politics and its practitioners, is such a popular instinct today. Democracies, however, need political parties. We need political organizations, permanent organizations that earn political power and that govern, that are forced to articulate disparate interests and viewpoints, that can recruit and develop future government leaders. But to survive, political parties must regain the ability to inspire and mobilize people, especially the young who disdain politics or prefer to channel their energy through single-issue groups. Parties must be willing to overhaul their structure, mindset, and methods to adapt to a new world. So I thought I would start the discussion by asking Ben, whether he agrees with these kind of opening comments by Moises Naim and the current sort of anti-party, anti-politics moment, and what the most recent elections, going back to 2016, tell us about the state of political parties today, and how the nature of our party structure today affects the kind of politics that we have. So if you can start with that small set of questions.
As the Aaron Murphy of this panel, I am more than happy to. So I do agree. I do completely agree with the sentiment of the article, and I think our political parties in the United States today are at an historic weak point. I think there are certainly the global forces that the article talks about responsible for that, but there are also some self-inflicted wounds that we've done legislatively.
Speaking to the microphone a little more.
There are self-inflicted wounds that have occurred to the political parties that have sort of enhanced that decline in this country. The most obvious of those is the McCain-Feingold rule or law, which has resulted in a really bifurcated system that you can't even call a party system. And as you saw in both 2016 and even more in 2018, we now have a system where the candidates are not the loudest voices in their campaigns. The parties have little ability to bolster them. And in fact, outside groups using precisely the kinds of money that candidates and parties can't touch are the loudest voices in the campaigns and actually setting the agenda and, in many instances, the tones for those campaigns. And whether you come at this from the point of thinking there should be regulation of money in politics, or the more conservative point of view that more regulation is bad, it's a system that doesn't work, because in an ideal world you would want the candidates and their political parties to be the loudest voices in campaigns and setting the agenda, and they are not today. So the system itself has helped the decline of those parties. I think Citizens United contributed to that. We'll talk about that as a sub-reason. But the parties should be providing sort of a cohesive, organizing, governing set of principles for their candidates in legislative bodies. And ideally, as the article says, you would have the clash of two kind of major idea forces going at it. By weakening the political parties as we have, candidates today can go out and do the essential things on their own without any cohesive governing force above them. They raise money on their own from outside interest groups. The mobilization efforts in this election did not take place through the political parties. They were kind of afterthoughts and press releases. And the real, even on-the-ground organizing took place with outside third-party groups using all that money you tried to ban in the law. And the third thing that parties used to do was to provide the messaging cover for their candidates to set the tone of the debate. And today, outside groups can have the resources to set the agenda throughout a full 2-year cycle and longer. Candidates get their money at the end. Parties get their money more towards the election also. They're not governing the terms of debate. And pay no attention to all those cash on hand numbers you see from the national committees. An individual can give $330,000 to a national party. That's a lot of money. 100,000 of that is for a building fund. 100,000 of that is for a legal proceedings fund. 100,000 of that is for a convention fund. 33,000 of that is for actual on-the-ground activities. Those other monies can't be used. They are in the cash on hand figures. So.
Could you give any concrete examples from the last elections of, especially if they're in high-profile races, of candidates who you feel lost control of the ability to frame the message because of outside groups and outside spending?
Well, I mean, I think you could go back through the ads of any of the major Senate races and most of the contested House races and see that from the beginning of the cycle, from January of 2015 or January of 2017, there were a barrage of issue ads that special interest groups wanted people to talk about. I'm not sure candidates ever got to the point of being able to talk about the issues that they did wish to talk about, whether that was health care or taxes or war and peace or social issues, because there was so much kind of noise from outside groups from the very beginning.
Bob, from the Democratic sort of party perspective, I take it you mostly or fully agree with Ben on this larger perspective on what's happened to the political parties. I guess it was interesting, Ben was talking both about the loss of control of parties to outside groups, but also the ability of individual candidates to be independent entrepreneurs because they could rely on outside money. They weren't dependent on the political parties. You see the same thing from the Democratic Party side as well?
Well, you know, as you know, I've worked and known Ben for a long time, and our relationship is characterized by perpetual disagreement. In this case, I agree with him on the fundamental question of weakness. I disagree with him on why it has come about. And if I could start with that, I didn't mean to dodge your question. I'll come back to your specific question in a minute. And that is, we have a tendency in this country, I think, still, to imagine parties in a particular way and to lament that we don't see them operating the way we think parties should. And I think that as a result, we've seen, for example, over time, changing definitions of parties to try to sort of rescue an idealized vision of how they operate. The parties that, for example, we had in the early 20th century, late 19th century, you know, frankly, as I was growing up, which we've observed was quite a while ago, those parties don't exist any longer. The parties are weaker. However, I disagree with Ben in one respect. I think that is a function of changes in the political structure and in the political process. And so, for example, I view the campaign finance reforms that did deal a blow to the parties at the turn of the century. Those campaign finance reforms were not the cause, although they certainly exacerbated the weaknesses of the parties. They were a reflection of how weak the parties were because they couldn't defend themselves in the legislative process. the individual elected representatives, who were, after all, elected as party members, Democrats or Republicans, didn't see it as in their interest to defend the institutional parties against what was, in fact, a realignment of power away from the party system to the outside groups, a development, of course, that was furthered and significantly advanced by decisions like Citizens United. I will observe, I was at a county party organization the weekend before the election in the Midwest, and there was a big sign at the county party opening table that basically said, if you could, we're looking for donations of water and trash bags. It seemed a little bit depressing to me. It was staffed with very able volunteers, but resource limitations were obvious all across the board. So I think what we have to recognize is that we have a political culture that is not fertile ground for political parties in the terms in which we've discussed them in the past. And for that reason, I don't believe the answer lies in, or will ultimately be effective in sort of, legislative changes of one kind or another, except to the extent that if parties are currently laboring under unnecessary and antiquated legal impediments, and it's making it harder for them to, say, compete with outside groups that make unlimited expenditures and accept unlimited money to make unlimited expenditures, we should remove those limitations from the parties. We should give the parties an opportunity to compete effectively in the political marketplace without any expectation that they will prosper. Now, to answer your specific question, I think candidates have been for quite some time individual entrepreneurs. Depending on the level of the race, they're more or less needy, they're more party dependent, much, much lower down. But at, say, the federal level, candidates can, in many respects, and certainly incumbents, can make their own arrangements and operate outside the party, both raising their own money, depending on outside groups, and not be terribly affected by the weakness of the National Party. And I'll just close by pointing out that the Democratic National Committee, I just checked this number this morning, and this is rough, it's off of the Open Secrets website, and I didn't dig in to see all what the subcategories were, but the total expenditures of the Democratic National Committee, that's the National Committee of the Democratic Party in the United States, in the 2018 cycle was $148 million. One super PAC, the Democratic Majority PAC, spending in Senate races, raised and spent $112 million. That is $30 million less. That's one of the super PACs, spent $30 million less than the Democratic National Committee as a whole. I think that's a very telling statistic.
But I'm confused a bit about your disagreements with Ben or where this goes. So you agree that it's extremely important for the political process to have strong political parties, but you say that we're not going to have that anymore as a result of all of these various structural and other kinds of changes. So what is the world of democratic politics going to look like in the absence of the kind of strong parties that Moises Naim is talking about? I mean, isn't it going to produce just an incredibly fragmented political process where there's no coherence, there's no capacity to form effective governing majorities? I mean, what does this world look like?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure because we're in the middle of it. So where it all ends up is a little bit difficult to envision. But I think you're going to see, and I think you do see, a plurality of different organizations, some of which serve party purposes in the aggregate. For example, the Democratic Majority PAC is a Democratic Majority PAC, right? And it's an outside group and it's not a party organization, but it functions as what some people call a shadow party organization because it is committed to electing Democrats, but it's not a party organization, and it operates under different rules than the parties do. And I think you'll see a variety of different ways that candidate, political party, ideological group interests are satisfied. Does it create, as you say, a sort of bewildering landscape in which it's kind of hard to sort things out the way we used to? Here are the Democrats, here are the Republicans. I'm reminded of these images on cable where you see on election night the donkey and the elephant are racing each other. The cartoon figures are racing each other. It's a simplified universe, much simplified universe. There are individual candidates for office who, with more or less fidelity to the law, set up their, quote, own super PACs. They're literally creating their own auxiliary organizations to help finance their campaigns. So it's a very complicated world, and just exactly how we come out of it, I don't know. But to answer your specific question, I don't think we help ourselves in understanding what's taking place or even thinking about what the policy choices are by hypothesizing kind of a golden age of parties indispensable to the political system that we can conjure back into place through legislation or by, for example, placing restrictions on other forms of organizations that have developed in recent years.
So, Paul, let me bring you into the discussion a bit if I can here, because I don't know exactly what your views are about the state of political parties today and the alienation of many young people from party politics altogether, but you have defended a view of a strong role for party leaders in the nominations process because, as many of you probably know, the Democratic Party since the 1980s, it had a role for superdelegates in its nominating process at the convention. They were something like 15 to 20% of the delegates, and they were official party figures, national, state, local, who were not selected through the primary election process, but were there to represent the judgment of the establishment party. And there was just a big internal debate in the Democratic Party led by the Sanders forces demanding that the Democrats get rid of these superdelegates. They were, by and large, Clinton supporters in the 2016 process. The DNC did agree to make a change in which the superdelegates no longer are allowed to vote on the first ballot, but if we ever get to a second ballot, which with 25 candidates may very well happen in the next cycle, then the superdelegates have a role. So just your perspective on both the conventions, the superdelegates, and the parties more broadly.
Yeah, so what I've written about this is that I think the DNC arrived at a completely incoherent compromise. It's incoherent because, on the one hand, they've delegitimized the superdelegates by saying they can't vote on the first ballot. But on the second hand, on the other hand, they may well be the deciding vote on a second or subsequent ballot. And although you may say, well, that never happens, it never goes to a second or subsequent ballot, this year, the Democratic field is exceptionally fragmented, plus the DNC has set rules not allowing any winner-take-all primaries, so they're all proportional. And if you have a highly fragmented field and proportional allocation of delegates, it may very well be the case that you come to the convention without any candidate having a majority. Now, what the superdelegates have done in the past is not, in fact, to overrule the primary voters, but actually to help put the leading candidate over the top. And they can't play that role now except on a second ballot. Well, that going to a second ballot may also just open up all sorts of possibilities for deals, may also prevent the convention from serving its purpose of promoting the candidate. It may become something of a train wreck. And so that's what I mean by an incoherent compromise. It's actually an example of what Ben was saying as a self-inflicted wound. The party officials were not willing to stand up for their own legitimate role in the process. And so here's the sort of larger sort of democratic question here. In our institutions, we stagger the votes for the Senate, for example. We don't elect all of our public officials at one time. The underlying assumption, I think, is that we don't want to let public sentiment at one moment determine government. We want to register that public sentiment over some period of time. I think, in effect, the superdelegates, many of whom are elected officials in their own states, were a means of providing that kind of staggered public input. It seems to me that it has a completely legitimate democratic pedigree, and instead, the theory that's apparently been overwhelming all others is the idea that the nominee has to reflect the views of the primary voters. But the primaries are low turnout events. They are only a small fraction of the voters that the party will need in November. It makes much more sense to have, as part of that process, party leaders who've been elected, party officials who are looking toward the need to win in November. It's just to me the common sense idea that a party nomination process should be aimed at choosing nominees who will win in November and then govern well. And that's the other aspect. But there is what a number of people have called a peer review aspect to the role of the superdelegates. People in politics who know the candidates up close and have an ability to provide another basis for judgment. And I think we're losing that in favor of a mistaken conception of democracy.
Go ahead, Guy. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this also ties some of the things that we were talking about in the last panel. We're seeing a democratization or an impulse toward democratization of almost all American institutions, including the party system. And it's having a tension between sort of the elite conception and conceptions of elite control with conceptions of either populism or democratization, right? And particularly in this particular context, where the assumption is that the people must control, right? Whether the people are the primary voters themselves, or outsiders or outside groups. And the attempt then to try to effectuate popular control across a number of different types of domains and possibilities. So whether those are super PACs or they're through individual candidates themselves. But this impulse is one that, yes, perhaps we might like it in the context of ballot initiatives and those outcomes, but it creates a tension in this particular context that we will have to try to figure out how to work out. And to build on something that Bob mentioned earlier, I think part of the question for the 21st century is, well, what are the roles that were fulfilled by the parties, at least an ideal conception of the parties that are being unfulfilled today or less fulfilled, and what is left over for the parties? My best guess is that we're going to see parties as really delivering on legislative outcomes, that will be their core function. And the other things that they used to do will be done by other types of entities. But I think this is a function of the tension between sort of this populist constitutionalizing impulse versus this conception of centralizing or elite control.
But this is exactly my concern, which is that the parties won't be able to deliver legislative governance. In the American system, with separation of powers between the House, the Senate, the presidency, it's extremely difficult to legislate. It was intentionally designed to be difficult to legislate. You have to overcome the hurdles of these three different institutions elected with different constituencies and different time cycles, as Paul said. And in order to do that, you need substantial coherence at the top from the party leaders and the ability to discipline, in a sense, recalcitrant party members, bring them along when they don't want to be brought along, to support an agenda that enables a party, when it has control of one institution at least, to actually enact some legislative program. And precisely because of the independent entrepreneurialism now of individual candidates who can stand alone, raise money on their own, reach a huge constituency through social media, cable television. They don't have any gatekeepers, party leaders. Party leaders have much less in the way of tools to bring them along. That the fragmentation is going to penetrate into the Congress. And you're going to see, as we've seen, say the Republican Party on one of its major agendas, with control of the House and the Senate, the healthcare, repealing Obamacare, they can't do it because there's too many conflicts within the Republican caucus. We'll see how the Democratic Party deals with the immigration issue, especially if they end up after 2020 with unified control of the House and the Senate. How can we actually have effective governance? This is my concern ultimately. It's about generating effective governance. And can we do that in a world in which the parties are so fragmented and in which there's so many more independent entrepreneurs in politics? Bert, you have been chomping at the bit to get in.
Rick, as usual, you, I think, put a finger on something very important, and that's when you think about political parties, traditionally we've thought of political parties as electoral vehicles, as the vehicle that gets the party into power. You're taking it one step further and talking about political parties as coordinating vehicles once the party is in power to enable them to operate effectively. But I think there's two things that, for both electoral and coordinating, that we have to think about. And that's first, and Guy raises it, what is the party? I mean, when we want to think about the question of what is the Democratic Party, what is the Republican Party, I have a hunch that both Bob and Ben would say it's the apparatus. It's the internal apparatus of the party, the pros, the pals that run it. But maybe it's the elected officials. Maybe it's all the elected officials who are the party. And that's where the superdelegate idea comes from. And then there's the idea that maybe the party is really the general members of the party, the ordinary folks in the community who are, Republicans or Democrats. And then there's a fourth idea, and that's that it's the loyalists. And that's the base who really comes out and vote. And depending upon who you think is the party, then you might want to ask how you want to organize the law so that element in the party becomes dominant. So far, I think everybody's been right that the existing campaign finance structure is an absolute disaster for parties. And it doesn't matter whether you're coming at it from the left or the right. As far as I'm concerned, the problem is not McCain-Feingold. The problem is not Citizens United. The problem is Buckley versus Vallejo. Buckley is a rotten tree. And it's going to fall in one direction or another. It's going to fall in the direction of no regulation, or it's going to fall in the direction of significant regulation. Both of those options will invigorate the party because they'll remove what Bob and Ben have quite correctly identified as the fact that who's afraid of the apparatus? The apparatus has absolutely no power. It can't raise any money. It can't discipline you. So who should listen to it? So we've essentially taken the apparatus out of the game as the party. And Bernie Sanders wants to make it the base. Well, I'm not so sure that's a good idea because that's about 15% of the folks that will participate in the primary. So then the question is, how do we get the other two components, the elected officials and the general membership, how do we enhance their power? And then if we could do that, I think we could work out a way to deal with Rick's coordination problems.
Bob, you said you wanted to.
Yeah, I wanted
in.
to just reply briefly. I was thinking about what Paul said about the, by the way, I should mention, as you know, the firm you cited that I was affiliated with for many years and partner in for many years, I'm not there any longer, and I'm not here representing any party. I don't represent the DNC. I don't represent, as my former colleagues do, the Senate candidate currently fighting the recount in Florida. So I want to just put that out there so that whatever bias I have, it isn't too obvious.
You failed, but go ahead.
The DNC, I don't know that from a certain point of view, I can understand why the DNC's position on the elected officials, and this ties back into Bert's comment, why the DNC's decision about the superdelegates and denying them a role in the first ballot might seem incoherent. But from another perspective, a different definition of coherence, I think it's highly coherent. It's coherent in the sense that it is very difficult to imagine how the party, and specifically to a certain audience it's trying to address, which are sort of the younger voters they're trying to bring into the party who are very suspicious of institutions and sort of very a la carte, if you will, in their preferences. They're not going to sign on to the party program as a whole. They're going to sign on to whatever party offers them what they most very much want. It seems to be very difficult for a party to say, we're going to have an electoral process, and then on the very first ballot, when the people who have been elected through that process, who become the delegates through that process, convene, will bring in a lot of elected officials and they'll put their thumb on the scales. I know from speaking to friends of my 22-year-old son and his colleagues that they found the whole concept of superdelegates completely mystifying, if not outrageous. They simply couldn't understand it and complained bitterly about it and responded very strongly to what Bernie Sanders had to say about it. On the second ballot, where voter choice suddenly seems unclear, or let's say not definitive, you could imagine that the party elected officials kind of join into the fray, and as Bert said, there may be deal making, and there may be multiple ballots, and there may be a real free-for-all. Boy, that sounds to me like a real political party, something very different than the kind of scripted nonsense that we see on the air, which is essentially a reality TV show built for the party to promote results that have already been reached and controlled by the nominee of the party. I don't mean to call it nonsense, but let's say it's not vibrant. And as you know, the networks carry fewer and fewer hours of convention coverage, and the audience for it is declining. So if you have a free-for-all on multiple subsequent ballots, because the first ballot indicated that there was genuine indecision about the outcome, you could argue that that would be party invigorating in some sense. And that just ties into my point that I wanted to reply to on Bert. I don't know how to view elected officials as party representatives. They are party representatives, to be sure, and they organize themselves into caucuses in the legislature, but they are also representatives of their own individual political interests. The Democratic Senate and Congressional Campaign Committees, which I represented for many years, I don't any longer, are essentially caucuses of office holders who are primarily interested in making sure that the party achieves a majority in the legislature. I don't think that's a good thing. It's consistent with party objectives overall, but they have a very specific interest as elected officials in maintaining the majority, both winning their own elections and bringing in colleagues who bring them to 51%. And going back again to the youth, to my 22-year-old son and his friends, you know, I think they distinguish significantly between their interests and any party interests that they would find appealing.
And Ben, you wanted to jump in, but in particular, this issue of younger voters who are so anti-elite, anti-politics, anti-party. I mean, how do we construct, if it's imaginable, a world in which parties do still have the capacity to provide some kind of organized structure to government, you know, in the face of these kinds of pressures?
A good question. First of all, I want to say it's an honor to be on a panel with you now that you've entered into the free spirit phase of your life without any boundaries.
You talking to me?
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I was looking at me
No,
and I was like,
no, I was looking
I've
at
always
Bob.
been there. I don't know.
No, that's fine. I'm just, let me get to your question by making a broader point about the superdelegates and the Republican rule changes for the 2016 election, which both go to show really about the huge mistake that the parties are making and why they are not really viable institutions anymore. Both are fighting the last war. They're not looking at the reality on the ground. Republicans were upset that Mitt Romney, as the front runner, got weakened over the course of the 2002 primaries by a series of lesser candidates being able to jab at him all the time with debates. The 2016 rules were designed to protect the front runner. They just kind of were surprised at who emerged as the early front runner and then got protected. The Democrats are fighting the last war too. Whatever went on with superdelegates in 2016 with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton is not going to be the reality on the ground with a multi-candidate field. And someone mentioned the proportional representation, Paul did, the proportional representation that is the rules of the Democratic primary, no winner take all. Any candidate who gets more than 15% in a primary gets some delegates. I mean, close your eyes and imagine how that's not going to lead to a real, I think, sense of chaos, which goes to the point of the parties are no longer driven by what they should be doing, Bert, which is the overarching kind of governing principles, maybe liberal and conservative. And instead, in these multi-candidate fields, you are probably going to end up with a personality-driven nominee. Certainly the lesson Republicans learned from 2016. Why, when you dump 2 dozen candidates into primaries with debates is really the only thing that's going to weed them out, produce a big personality, which is not going to be consistent, I think, with the governing strategy. So then to get back to the youth question and how you manage to get people engaged in the process, it is probably over you would hope that it could be over a battle of ideas as opposed to a battle of personalities. But I fear we are going down a path where that's unlikely because you don't have the basic structures in the parties to be able to generate out a sort of consistent governing philosophy.
Guy, did you have a
Yeah, I mean,
comment?
just to build off of that, I mean, but again, part of it is think about, it's not just about the youth, it's also about other types of marginalized voters. When we're telling people, and you can think about this as well as the Democratic Party, one person, one vote, right? Sort of like that as a fundamental principle of equality. And yet at the same time, you're trying to sell them on superdelegates. There is a tension that needs to be reconciled. Right, when you're telling them about the importance of fairness and equality, they think proportionality. And so it does make sense in this world in which we're starting to question. Now we're seeing more articles questioning the structure of the Senate. People are thinking about fairness differently. We were talking about political gerrymandering earlier. There are these underlying democratic principles that are in tension, and we're seeing them being reconciled in ways that may or may not make sense, but I think it is a function of sort of these types of principled clashes. And yes, you have to sell the youth, but you have to sell voters of color as well. You have to sell women, right? You have to sell a number of different types of groups, particularly the ones who were once marginalized, and you have to sell them on the ideals and principles of the party. And these are the types of compromises that I think reflect the attempt to put together these different types of coalitions. So I agree that it is, in some senses, the last war is being fought on both sides, but there are also some other things that are going on as well.
Can we just ask anybody who wants to get into this discussion? So I agree with Ben that this image of 25 or some candidates who are, all roughly plausible, let's say, trying to compete for the nomination in 2020 on the Democratic side with these proportionality rules. It seems like a recipe for chaos. How can voters reasonably sort through this group of candidates? Who's going to decide which ones are actually on the first debate stage versus the kiddie table, and now there's going to be like a toddler table or something if there's that many of them. So are there specific changes to the nomination process that are, plausible? I don't mean ones that are pie in the sky, but that are plausible to manage what's emerging so that we can sort through these candidates in some kind of way that doesn't immediately lend itself to what Ben was pointing out, which is the biggest celebrity, in a sense, has such a huge advantage in a situation like this. And Paul, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or Bert, or anybody.
Well, I've never been able to distinguish in my career between pie in the sky and practical solutions. That's been one of my problems. But let me suggest.
We'll get to your pie in the sky idea in a minute, actually.
Yeah, that's a pie in the universe. On the primaries, or at least on the selection process, having 25 candidates out there, all shouting for the same process, raises two issues, to me anyway. One, has the day of the two major parties peaked? In other words, can we squeeze the enormous complexity and diversity of the modern democratic state, in which we really have succeeded in bringing into the electorate so many segments of the electorate that over the years were suppressed in a sense where we could have two hegemonic parties, in large part because a lot of voices weren't being heard. If we bring all the voices in, is it possible to have them live in two tents? Or are we headed inevitably for a multi-party system, a system that will have where the coordination and electoral functions will continue to be performed by political parties, but there won't be two political parties. That's not necessarily written in stone. And the second, if we're going to save the political parties, the two political parties, it seems to me the key has to be figure out how to way to increase the turnout in primaries. The fact that the primaries are essentially owned completely by the extreme wings of both parties because of the low turnout, because you get a 15 or 20% turnout in the primary, so you get the fervent people at both ends dominating who the candidates are going to be. If there is some way to figure out a way to get more of the primary electorate in there, and my pie in the sky solution is, why not really treat primaries as though they are really the kind of closed elections. They are the election of the party. And why not use proxies? We use proxies in corporate elections. We use proxies in many, many different electoral structures where where there would be a lousy turnout and the system wouldn't work. Why not try to experiment with allowing people to cast their votes in a primary, either on election day or to vest someone with their proxy so that you can collect the proxies during the process. When you finally tabulate the votes, it'll be more than 15% of the party voting. So that's my pie in the sky.
Well, just on this matter of whether we're going to continue to have two parties, so we live in an era of weak parties, but of intense polarized partisanship. So that's a sort of odd pairing that, in fact, people are now more strongly identified with these two parties. Just at the moment, their organization, their institutional power has deteriorated. And so I think that has to be recognized. Just in answer to what Bob Bauer was saying about young voters not agreeing with the legitimacy of the superdelegates, I think there's a term that the political theorist Nancy Rosenblum uses, anti-partyism. And it has a long history in the United States, really going back to the founding, anti-partyism. And yet, despite all this long tradition of anxiety about the power of parties keep performing their role, they keep having their centrality, and there needs to be a clear articulation of why that is, what the reason, what role they perform, what democratic function they perform, and I think that the party's officials and elected leaders ought to stand up for those things instead of wilting in the face of criticism.
In terms of the specifics on the nomination process and changes that might be productive, if there are any, Ben or Bob, did you have specific ideas about that? I know you have some at least.
They may seem like nibbling a little bit around the edges, but it goes to my point that I don't see any reason why parties ought to be disadvantaged in performing fundamental functions, like, for example, supporting their candidates and competing with, super PACs and the like. So, for example, in the nominating process, right now, parties in the last cycle were yielding a significant amount of their authority in the structuring the debates to networks. The networks decided what polling percentages constituted the threshold for admission, and then they fiddled, in at least one case with the polling percentage, to put a candidate in the adult group as opposed to at the kiddie table. Lindsey Graham, who was a senior senator with foreign policy credentials, never made it from the kiddie table to the adult table, whatever we call it, the grown-up table. But the parties weren't making those decisions, and they were content in some respects. I'm not, you can argue about which party handled it better or worse, but to some extent, neither of them resisted the notion of surrendering that authority. And part of that, just part of it, not all of it, was a function of the expense of these debates that's hard for parties to bear. Now, you could solve that problem by giving them regulatory relief that would be targeted to their ability to finance debates. And so that they're actually taking back from large media corporations the responsibility that's really critical in primaries for staging these kinds of debates. I think that would be helpful I don't think it would necessarily be
So
revolutionary.
the idea is that the parties would take over putting on the debates?
Correct. The
Yeah.
parties would
They
make
would
those
fund
decisions.
them,
The
and
model-
hopefully the television cameras would show up?
But they
and-
would.
Yeah,
I'm confident.
the model is antiquated. The model is, and this is like one of the ways that party chieftains sort of try and maintain their relevance, is you go from news outlet to news outlet to news outlet to do the debates. With technology today, the parties could rent out a studio in some low-cost market, outfit it, have scheduled the debates for however they wanted to, let the media come in and live broadcast them. The cost would be much less, and you wouldn't have to go through this rigmarole of having the media drive things. And to Bob's point, the way Republicans chose their field was by 500-person sample media polls, so that somebody got in or out of a debate based on like 0.01% of a media poll. The media polls, that great transparent institution that they are, never told you where the people they polled live, nor how much their pollsters like messed with the turnout models to impact the results, so that the people who chose whether Lindsey Graham got in a debate or not could have been New Yorkers and Californians, and not the people in like New Hampshire and Iowa and South Carolina who impacted. It was a totally corrupt and ridiculous system. You shouldn't use the polls at all, except maybe to do a rank order of people. And then what we should have done was to have the top poller, the third poller, the fifth poller, the seventh poller in one debate, and the second, fourth, sixth, and eighth person in a second debate, all on one night, all done in a studio controlled by the party. And you would have been much more equal, and you would have had a better chance to look at the candidates.
And I thought you were pushing even harder for something like the DNC or the RNC, because they're sponsoring the debates themselves, identifying the 5 candidates or 8 candidates or whatever
We're setting the
who will be, and using whatever criteria they think are the relevant
They
criteria.
would devise the criteria, and then as parties, they would be accountable for it. I mean, it's bizarre to say, it seems to me, in the Republican primaries, for the Fox News to have to answer for the question of whether Carly Fiorina goes at the grown-up table, even though she didn't meet the criteria. So the criteria then get revised so that she can go into that one debate onto the grown-up stage. And the party's like, well, that was CNN's, or excuse me, Fox's decision, or whichever network it was. I think it was Fox. Why shouldn't the party be accountable? It seems to me if we want strong parties, you have to give parties functions that they perform, and then they're accountable for how well they perform those functions. And that just, I'll just drop a footnote to that. This is why I worry when we talk about, there's a crowded field. I think that field will be very quickly narrowed. It will be narrowed by press vetting. It will be narrowed by the candidates making monumental mistakes because they're actually not plausible candidates. They're not qualified to be president, and they'll fall all over themselves. And so eventually this field will narrow. And if by any chance it does turn out that it creates uncertainty at the end of the process, and we go to a convention in which the candidate isn't identified in the first ballot, I know the press will characterize it as chaos, quote unquote, or quote unquote turmoil. We've been talking here about political parties. I don't know that that's necessarily the worst possible outcome. It'll get sorted out, and somebody's going to emerge. And maybe that's the strongest thing, the best thing for the party, that it winds up playing a significant role in the setting of the convention, in the selection of the nominee.
Well, Bob, it's going to be a very interesting experiment from the point of view of political science if it does work out that way. I think most people have assumed that it's to the advantage of a party if it has resolved that issue before a convention, and if that candidate is then able to repair cleavages within the party and able to present a unified front by the time of the convention, we'll see.
And I think that may be true, but in this day and age, then you look at, for example, the Trump experience, and you could even argue the Democratic experience in 2016 to a lesser degree, and it isn't clear that it actually worked that way, or that the cleavages were in fact resolved. I could be wrong about that.
Let me throw in an idea for reforming the primaries. The primaries of both parties are now spread out over a really lengthy period of time that may be creating false incentives for whoever gets nominated. It would focus the debate more if there were fewer primary days. There are now so many primary days, largely to feed the egos of the members of the National Committee who all want the circus to come to their town. And you would, I think, lose a lot of the showbiz part of primaries if you had one national primary day for divided up primary days, 3 weeks apart. But there are ways to focus the primaries themselves so that the parties do have more control over it and it becomes a more cohesive enterprise than it is now.
Ben, how about regional primaries?
Yeah, it could be regional, could be by size of states. I mean, there are a lot of different ways you could.
And how about increasing the turnout? How could you, I think everybody has agreed, left to right on the political spectrum, that one of the reasons the primary movement has failed, or is, the hopes, the romantic hope about transferring direct democracy down to the selection of candidates, one of the reasons that has not worked out the way that the reformers thought it would was no one predicted that the turnouts would be as low as they are in primaries. Is there a way, I suggested a radical idea of trying to use proxies. I mean, billions of dollars turn on corporate proxy elections, and they seem to do them. But assume you don't want to think that way because of the obvious fraud and expense problems. Are there other ways of increasing turnout?
So I do think that reducing the number of primary days would potentially have the effect of increasing turnout, because part of the reason the turnout is so low is the farther out you get, it's like it doesn't matter as much. So if there were a number of states concentrated on fewer days, that might have the effect of increasing turnout.
But it's funny. So Bert, your instinct is it's a deep one in the political culture. It's always like, well, turnout didn't turn out to be what we wanted. If only we could increase turnout more. What new things can we do? The solution is find ways to get people more engaged to participate. And I worry that this is a bit of a kind of a political activist or reformist kind of fantasy, that people really want that level of constant participation and constant engagement. And the other direction to go, once you acknowledge the failure of primaries, if that's true, is to think, well, maybe should we really have primaries as an important filtering mechanism? So leave aside the presidential election. Let's talk about candidates for the House or the Senate. What do we make of the example of Connor Lamb and the special election in Pennsylvania? So Connor Lamb, now this seems like ancient history, but he was celebrated in this brief moment of time by Democrats because in the special election in Pennsylvania, he ran in a very pro-Trump district, which he managed to win. And in part, that was because he was considered a candidate who was so well suited to the district with his policy positions on guns, on abortion, various positions that are, more moderate, let's say, if that's the right term, than the typical Democratic candidate, but well suited to Western Pennsylvania. Now, how did Connor Lamb get chosen to run as the Democrat in that special election? It was not through a primary, because it was a special election. So basically, a fairly large group of Democratic Party executive officials from the relevant counties in the district got together, they interviewed 6 or 7 different candidates, and they thought he was the most compelling candidate for the Democratic Party to run in that election. And lo and behold, they were right in terms of predicting outcomes. So why isn't that a model we ought to be talking about more?
That is, of course, how it used to work, and that is how it works in many others, perhaps most other democracies. Let me just mention a recent article by 2 political scientists, Ben Page and Marty Gillens. This is an article in the magazine I co-edit, The American Prospect, and they have a number of proposals, and one of them is the shocking idea of eliminating primaries in favor of November-only elections, but these November-only elections would have ranked choice voting. And so there would be party-endorsed candidates, but there'd be also other candidates. So it would be, the parties wouldn't have a lock on the November-only elections, but it would deal with this problem that Bert was alluding to, that the primaries have very low turnout. They're actually not representative of the voters in November, and maybe we should reconsider. Now, I don't think this is going to happen, but I think it's an important idea to get out there to recognize that the primary system is not likely to get fixed.
Well, but don't forget, the primary system didn't fall from the sky. The primary system replaced an unacceptably corrupt system in which the political leaders were choosing people. And in my own mind, I've never been able to make this necessarily, I haven't done the empirical work, so I can't assert it as a fact, but my own assumption had been, you can trust the political leaders to make this when they are choosing candidates for a competitive election, because then they have every incentive of choosing a good candidate and a candidate for the correct electoral reasons. The moment you gerrymander, and you know who's going to win the election in advance, giving the power to choose the candidate to the political leader is like giving them a blank check. I mean, the corruption there is enormous because they know their candidate is going to win. The only question is, what can they extract from the process themselves? So the notion of getting rid of primaries and going back into the smoke-filled room strikes me as being a tremendously dangerous experiment, unless it's a smoke-filled room where you have lots of competitive elections. And then the incentives are aligned correctly. How about another, as long as we're playing pie in the sky? What about saying, if you have a primary election, the only way you can win a primary election is to gain a certain basic percentage of the party membership. So that if only 15% of the party membership votes, you don't get the nomination because the election fails. And then maybe you would kick that over to the party leaders and let them select the candidate after the first choice has been given to the people. But you can build into the primary system incentives to participate and restraints on having the smallest number of the party win without throwing it over and giving it back to the.
Can you make it quickly, because I want to introduce one
Yeah,
last
just
subject.
very fast. I do want to say, again, speaking of not necessarily suggesting something that's going to have a transformative effect, but we've talked about primaries failing in voter turnout there. There's also general election turnout that isn't as healthy as it should be, including, for example, in a relatively high turnout election like the last one, where I believe under 50% of the eligible electorate cast a ballot. And there are things that we could still do to significantly improve the accessibility of the voting process. I still don't know, this is a country that's resolutely refused, for example, to to have, for example, elections held, declare a holiday on voting, to make it easier for people who have other commitments, particularly people who really cannot easily navigate around those commitments, vote. I think that would be helpful. It's not clear to me why we wouldn't do that, and it's interesting to consider why.
So let me put another subject on the table that we have a little bit of time to talk about, because in the last few months, there's been this sudden injection, I think, into public discussion about the structure of the Senate and how we should think about that. And it's fascinating. Many of us have made points over the years about how this is the least democratically structured institution in the Western world, if you look at the population disparities. But it's been a non-issue, I mean, in terms of public debate. And it seems suddenly in the last several months, there's really been an explosion of attention to this issue. And there are various reasons we can speculate about for that. The original disparity between the largest state and the smallest state when the Constitution was formed was about 6-1 in population. Now, if you take California and Wyoming, it's about 80-1 or something like that. 70.
65, maybe.
No, it's at least in the 70s, I
Yeah,
think.
well, the problem
But
is.
in any event, the difference has obviously become very much larger. Bert has a piece that's going to come out in the Wall Street Journal with I don't know if you call it creative or pie in the sky idea, Bert, But why don't you talk about what that proposal is, and then we can
All right.
maybe have some discussion
Sure.
about this.
Just a word in support of the relationship between romance and reform. I went to high school in 1954, and I went to high school when it was still legal to have apartheid. I lived in a regime of legally imposed apartheid. And I dreamed in those years of a world in which we wouldn't have something like that, and in which women wouldn't be oppressed as they were, and where we wouldn't have McCarthy, and we wouldn't have the kinds of restriction on religion, the insistence on religious conformity. And they laughed at those. In those years, reformers got laughed at because those dreams were pie-in-the-sky dreams. And you don't change, you do not change embedded problems in a culture by saying, can we do this tomorrow, by a series of discernible events that will take us from step one to step two. Reformers have a genius for the capillary. And what they will do is change small things in the hopes that it will fix things, and then when it doesn't work, they throw up their hands and they say, it can't be fixed. And my plea to you is American democracy is suffering. It's suffering. It is not the idea that we all hoped it would be, and it's not going to be fixed by capillary fixes. It's going to be fixed by having the commitment and the will to engage in reform that is linked in some way to idealism and romance. You can tell that I'm building up to something that lots of people are going to laugh at, because it is a kind of romantic idea, and it's this. The reason that we haven't debated, I mean, Rick is absolutely right. The Senate is probably the least democratic institution in the Western world, less democratic than the House of Lords, probably. And the assumption is that it's baked into the Constitution, that there's nothing we can do about it, because the compromise that brought the nation into being was a compromise to have an unamendable provision in Article 5 saying the equal suffrage of the states can't be changed without their consent. So the Senate, every state gets the same vote in the Senate, whether or not, whatever its population. And as Rick points out, it was 6-1. At the beginning, Madison didn't like it, but he swallowed it because it was the only way he could bring the nation into being. It's 65. It's funny. I became a lawyer because they promised there'd be no math. My math was 65-1. Rick's may be right. It may be 80-1. But whatever it is, the Wyoming to California ratio is just absolutely out of, it's impossible to think of it. If the Senate purports to make laws for the nation, then everybody in the nation should have a roughly equal political say as to what those laws will be, and that's just not the case now. It's 65-1. So here's my suggestion. The founders left a way open. I can't amend the Constitution to fix the Senate, but Article 4, which is the provision of the Constitution that provides for the admission of new states and for the creation of new states out of old states. That's happened, by the way, 5 times. In 1791, Vermont was created from New York. In 1792, Kentucky was created from Virginia. In 1795, Tennessee was created from North Carolina. In 1820, Maine was created from Massachusetts. In 1863, West Virginia was created from Virginia. The process is that the Senate has to give consent, the Congress has to give consent, and the state legislatures of the affected areas have to give consent. But as long as that is satisfied, there is no restriction on changing the number of states and changing the number of representative entities in the Senate. So here's my the Democracy Restoration Act of 2023. I plan to live to 2023, by the way. The Democracy Restoration Act of 2023, Democrats can't take the Senate in 2020. I just don't see how it can happen. But they could take the Senate in 2022. So the Restoration Act of 2023 says, whenever a state reaches, a populous state reaches a ratio a population ratio to the smallest state, let's say 20 to 1, whenever the ratio between Wyoming and a populous state is 20 to 1, the Senate hereby grants a blanket consent to that state to bifurcate into 2 states, as long as the state legislature of the old state and some representative body of the new putative state both agree. So that under the existing population, 8 states would qualify, states with more than 12 million. California, Texas, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and they would then have ongoing ongoing congressional consent to bifurcate, and then it would be a political question in that state, whether the people wanted to shake the status quo up enough in order to get new representation, additional representation. And it's not a stealth attack on the Republican Party, because if you bifurcate New York and California, you probably advantage the Republicans. If you bifurcate Texas and Florida, you help the Democrats. And so it doesn't necessarily create a partisan steel, but what it does do is it re-legitimates the Senate as a genuinely representative place. If you went to 10 to 1, it would be more. If you went to 6 to 1, which was the ratio that the founders lived with, but whatever ratio you choose, it is not beyond our capacity. It is a matter of will, energy, and determination to reinvigorate a democratic Senate. And we don't have to live. Urban America does not have to be a colony of Wyoming. It is possible to reconstitute the Senate as a genuinely representative democratic body.
A quick comment, because I want to open up for questions soon, but I told you he was the most creative public law thinker of his generation. Quick comment, Paul?
Yeah, this is a very interesting idea. Bert, I think it would raise new gerrymandering questions. How you divided those states would determine how they would vote. Okay, but so looking ahead to 2040, the demographic projections are that 30% of the country will elect 70% of the Senate. And now it just happens that 30% of the country is the more rural, more white part of the country. But just think of a counterfactual in which that 30% was actually the part of the country consisting of racial minorities, and they would have 70% of the votes in the Senate. Do you think the outcome of this conflict might be different?
Yes, at that point, it would become a sacrament to change it.
All right, we have time for a few questions, so if you come up to the mics, thanks for your patience to this point and waiting. Yes?
I know we don't like to look at what other countries do, but how about requiring universal voting? And, either with carrots or sticks or whatever. What's the panel's view of that?
Well, I'll just say briefly, so the model that's often touted for that is Australia. They have mandatory voting. They have 90-some% turnout. If you don't vote, you, I think, pay a nominal fine. And the claim from political scientists in Australia is this actually helps produce a more moderate form of politics because, somewhat ironically, the people you're bringing in and requiring to vote are the least politically engaged and the least politically informed. The activists are going to show up and vote. The people most ideologically engaged are going to show up. But that this provides sort of ballast towards the middle of the system. Now, in the United States, given our political culture, the idea of mandatory anything is a very, very difficult matter. Culturally, we saw this in the healthcare controversies, but Australia is the example that's typically used to make that point.
My only point is, what is really striking about American democracy is we do not have a serious norm of voting. We have, for example, a very powerful norm that people will rise up to defend about the privacy of the vote, but not voting. You can go into a room and say, I didn't vote, and you're not going to be ostracized. It's very difficult to build a mandatory requirement in the absence of even a vital norm.
But just one quick counter, Bob. I think we are developing a norm. It's actually interesting when you're living in a world in which Uber and Lyft want to give rides to people to the polls, when various cafes are offering discounts to people if they wear their I voted sticker. And I actually think we are developing in a world in which people are encouraging one another to vote. So I don't know that if you would be ostracized, but increasingly I think people are being frowned upon. So we are, I think, getting into that norm such that it might not be too long before the concept of mandatoriness is one that is debated without scorn.
Yes, on this side?
Two questions addressed to whomever would like to answer them. Wendy Gerber, class of 1983. First, with respect to the plurality we were discussing, I'm curious if you see other paradigms in Europe, et cetera, where there are multiple parties to choose from, whether you see that as viable within the United States. Second, in 2008, a Unity 08 party was put forward, and I know the actor Sam Waterston had been the face of it. And they were suggesting something that was kind of innovative, having a bipartisan president and vice president, one Republican, one Democrat. It's an innovative idea, and I'm curious about your thoughts about that as well.
Well, we tried it once, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, before there was the 12th Amendment. The guy that finished first got to be president. The guy that finished second got to be vice president. So the two opponents would run. It was a disaster. And that's why we have a 12th Amendment, because it doesn't work to have a collective executive where they fight with each other. I mean, I think it would change the nature of the structure.
Although it worked well with Lincoln when he brought his enemies on board in the cabinet.
And in the cabinet, where he could control them.
Multi-party. So, a quick thought about that. There are various perspectives you could look at these kinds of questions from. One of the big downsides with multi-party systems is they have to put coalitions together to govern. Those coalitions require often significant payoffs to smaller parties to make them into the coalition. So one of the advantages of a two-party system is that the bigger the political parties you have are, the broader array of interests they are capable of representing. And there's certainly a view that two-party systems, for all of the complaints, are more likely to produce sort of policies that reflect the median kind of preferences of voters, although there's a lot of distortion in that right now and the like. But with coalitional governments, you're doing massive payoffs to small groups. Israel is an example of this with the religious parties. Policies get adopted that wouldn't have anywhere near majority support in the country, but they have to be adopted to have those parties form part of the coalition. So that's part of the trade-off. On this side?
In the olden days, we had Tories and Whigs. Now we have Democrats and Republicans. It seems to me that the country is really shifting, call it either left and right or conservative and liberal, and I'm wondering if Democrats and Republicans might not exist anymore, and maybe we should be switching to those other two labels, or possibly to four. Republican liberal, Republican conservative, Democrat liberal, Democrat conservative, and become a four-party system.
Well, I think that just isn't recognizing the reality of polarization. There just aren't many Republican liberals left, and there aren't that many Democratic conservatives left. I mean, there's been a sorting process. This is what has actually happened. You can't kind of just say we should be something different. This is how we've developed. And people may regret this reality, but you'd have to change something about the institutions, something about the voting process. I mentioned ranked choice voting, which could enable third and fourth parties to play more of a role. But if we maintain our voting systems and our institutions the way they are, I don't think this is going to change.
Well, let me clarify. I agree with you then that the four-party system won't work, but how about the two parties becoming the liberal and the conservative?
But that's what they are now. I mean, we could change the names, but everybody knows the Democratic Party is the Liberal Party and the Republican Party is the Conservative Party.
Okay. I think
The sorting has taken place.
The last question over here, and
Yeah.
then we'll go to our lunch break, and we'll have our keynote address after we have a chance to get our boxed lunches, which are over there, come back here, and then we'll move on to that phase. Yes?
Hi, Carol Schlitt. I'm wondering where it is written in the Constitution that we should be voting on the first Tuesday in November. Why don't we move our voting day to a weekend? Why don't we have 2 days for voting instead of 1? That might help at least to increase the participation in our electoral process. Thanks.
It's not written in the Constitution. Bob was right when he suggested that we should move to a weekend. I've been suggesting that we should move to Veterans Day. If you're going to celebrate veterans, people who died, so that we could be able to participate in democracy, how better to celebrate them than to actually carry out the ballot? And it's already a holiday, so the Chamber of Commerce is not going to get angry about the creation of another holiday. So we could do it, and I bet it would raise the turnout 10%, like that.
It's worth noting that, well, you all live, most of you live in New York, so this is a little bit different, but most states around the country allow folks to vote on many, many, many different days. Election day is not one day between early voting, absentee voting, whatever. New York's a little different.
Okay, well, with that comment, let's thank the panelists and have lunch.